January 17th, 1944. The Marshall Islands. The air is a thick, suffocating curtain of humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. On a nameless ridge overlooking a turquoise lagoon, a Japanese private of the 51st Division clutches a rifle that has become too heavy for his skeletal frame. His stomach is a hollow ache. He has lived on palm roots and salt water for 3 weeks. His uniform is a collection of rags. His feet are swollen with tropical ulcers, and his eyes are sunken deep into a skull-like face. He looks out toward the horizon, praying for the silhouette of a rising sun, relief convoy that his commanders promised would arrive weeks ago. Instead, he sees the impossible. A massive, gray concrete vessel sits anchored just offshore, defiant and untouched by the surrounding chaos. It isn't a bristling battleship or a jagged carrier. It is a floating factory, humming with the rhythmic vibration of massive electric generators. Inside its reinforced hull, under bright incandescent lights, American sailors in clean white t-shirts are laughing. They aren't loading shells or sharpening bayonets. They are holding paper cups filled with frozen, creamy vanilla and strawberry ice cream, chilled to a perfect temperature by a cooling plant that consumes more power than an entire Japanese village. To the man dying in the jungle, this is not just a strange sight. It is a psychological hammer blow. It is a realization that while his empire expects him to die for a handful of dirt, the enemy has brought the comforts of a Kansas diner to the middle of a war zone. This was the moment the Japanese soldier realized that the war was no longer a contest of spirits, but a collision with an industrial giant that could weaponize luxury itself. The roots of this staggering disparity can be traced back to the very philosophy of the Japanese Imperial High Command. In the 1930s, as Japan expanded its reach across Manchuria and into China, their military doctrine relied on the concept of short war and self-sufficiency. The Japanese leadership believed that the spirit of the soldier, the Yamato Damashii, could overcome any material deficiency. In their planning, logistics were an afterthought, a secondary concern to the glorious clash of arms. This mindset was codified in the Japanese Field Service Code, which emphasized that troops should be able to live off the land they conquered. On the vast plains of China, this was possible, albeit through the brutal exploitation of local populations. But as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, this doctrine would lead to one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in military history. By 1941, the Japanese Empire had seized a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that spanned thousands of miles of open ocean. From the dense jungles of New Guinea to the tiny coral atolls of the Central Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army, IJN Navy IJN, established a ribbon defense. These were isolated outposts, meant to act as unsinkable aircraft carriers. However, these islands produced nothing. They had no cattle, no wheat fields, and limited fresh water. Every grain of rice, every bullet, and every bandage had to be shipped from the home islands across sea lanes that were becoming increasingly perilous. The Japanese logistics system was a fragile web of merchant ships, many of which were aging coal burners, protected by a navy that prioritized decisive surface battles over the unglamorous task of escorting convoys. Contrast this with the American mobilization. Following the shock of Pearl Harbor, the United States did not just build a military, it built a global delivery system. Under the guidance of men like General George C. Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, the U.S. realized that the Pacific was a war of distances. To win, they needed to move millions of tons of material across 6,000 miles of water. The American approach was rooted in the logistics of plenty. They didn't just want to supply their troops with enough to survive. They wanted to overwhelm them with support. This led to the creation of the Service Force, Pacific Fleet, a massive organization dedicated solely to keep him fed and keep him shooting. As the year 1942 turned into 1943, the strategic map of the Pacific began to change. The Americans, having halted the Japanese advance at Midway and Guadalcanal, initiated a strategy that would eventually turn the Japanese ribbon defense into a series of isolated graveyards. This was the birth of island hopping, or leapfrogging. Instead of attacking every fortified Japanese island, the Americans would bypass the strongest ones, seizing nearby locations to build airfields. Once an airfield was established, American air power and submarines would cut the sea lanes to the bypassed island. In an instant, a fortress like Rabaul or Truk, once a Gibraltar of the Pacific, was transformed from a threat into a self-contained prison. Thousands of miles from Tokyo, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were left to wait for a rescue that would never come. As the American leapfrogging strategy matured, the geography of the Pacific became a weapon. By early 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet and the South Pacific Area Command had perfected the art of isolation. When the Americans bypassed a stronghold, such as the massive base of Rabaul on New Britain, they didn't just leave it alone, they strangled it. They utilized the newly captured airfields to maintain a 24-hour blockade. Japanese supply ships, known as the Tokyo Express, were picked off by SPD Dauntless dive bombers by day and prowling Gato-class submarines by night. The Japanese merchant marine, the Maru fleet, was being decimated at a rate that Tokyo could not replace. For the Japanese soldiers stationed on these bypassed islands, the strategic silence was terrifying. Initially, the garrisons of places like Truk Lagoon or Wewak felt secure behind their concrete bunkers and heavy coastal guns. They waited for an American invasion that would allow them to die a shattered jewel death Gyokusai, taking as many Americans with them as possible. But the invasion never came. Instead, they watched from their ridges as American task forces steamed past them, heading further west toward the Philippines and Japan. The realization slowly dawned on the Imperial troops. They were no longer part of the war's front line. They were ghosts, left to rot on islands that the world had forgotten. Back in the United States, the industrial machine was hitting a stride that defied historical precedent. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks was producing advanced base units known as Lions, Cubs, and Acorns. These were pre-packaged cities that included everything from hospital beds to water distillation plants. While the Japanese soldier was being told to forage for lizards and fern roots, American logistics officers were calculating the recreation factor for their troops. The U.S. High Command understood that in the grueling heat of the tropics, morale was a resource as vital as oil. This led to the ice cream program. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal famously prioritized production of ice cream, believing it was the ultimate reminder of home. In 1945, the Navy spent over $1 million to convert a concrete barge into a floating ice cream parlor capable of producing 10 gallons every 7 seconds. This wasn't just about food. It was a display of surplus. The U.S. had so much shipping, so much milk, and so much electricity that they could afford to send a frozen dessert factory into a combat zone. Meanwhile, on islands just a few miles away, Japanese officers were issuing orders that any soldier caught stealing the commander's meager rice ration would be executed on the spot. The gap between the two nations was no longer measured in miles, but in calories. To understand the sheer magnitude of American industrial superiority, one must look past the carriers and the tanks to a vessel designated as the BRL, the barge, refrigerated, large. This was a 265-foot-long concrete hull, specifically designed to be towed into the heart of the Pacific. While the Japanese struggled to manufacture even basic radio components, the United States was mass-producing these floating cold storage warehouses. The most famous of these, the ice cream barge, was a marvel of naval engineering. It featured a specialized production line equipped with giant electric mixers, pasteurizers, and a massive refrigeration system capable of maintaining temperatures far below freezing in 100-degree tropical heat. It had the capacity to store 2,000 tons of fresh vegetables and 1,500 tons of frozen meat. But its primary psychological weapon was its ability to churn out 1,500 gallons of ice cream every shift. This was not a luxury reserved for generals. It was distributed to sailors on destroyers, pilots returning from missions, and even Marines in the mud of the front lines. The logistics were staggering. The U.S. Navy had to secure a supply chain of powdered milk, sugar, and flavorings that stretched across 6,000 miles of ocean. By making ice cream a standard ration, the U.S. military sent a chilling message to the enemy. We have so much excess capacity that we can treat a world war like a summer picnic. To a Japanese observer, who might spend a week's ration of fuel just to move a single squad, this was an alien form of warfare, a logistical dominance that bordered on the supernatural. The philosophy of the green desert. While the Americans were perfecting the art of the floating cold storage, the Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands were facing a nightmare they called the Green Desert. On islands like New Britain or Bougainville, the jungle appeared lush and full of life, but for a soldier without supplies, it was a barren wasteland. The Japanese doctrine of self-sufficiency was revealed to be a death sentence. The order of death became a grim reality in these bypass garrisons. As the rice ran out, the hierarchy of the Imperial Army began to collapse into a desperate struggle for survival. Soldiers were organized into farming battalions, tasked with clearing jungle to plant sweet potatoes. But in the nutrient-poor soil and constant rain, crops often rotted before they could be harvested. Malaria, scurvy, and beriberi began to kill more men than American bullets. Japanese officers, realizing that no ships were coming, had to make agonizing decisions. In some units, rations were distributed based on combat effectiveness, meaning the sick and wounded were given nothing, so that those still able to hold a rifle might live another day. This was a green desert at its most cruel, an environment where a soldier's greatest enemy was not the man in the opposite trench, but the biological clock of his own failing body. The contrast was total. On one side of the lagoon, a man died of scurvy. On the other, a man complained that his chocolate ice cream was slightly too soft. For the Japanese soldier, the psychological impact of American logistics of plenty was more devastating than any bombardment. Intelligence reports and captured diaries from the era reveal a profound sense of culture shock on the battlefield. Japanese troops were raised on the idea that Westerners were soft and decadent, unable to endure the hardships of a long campaign. However, as the war progressed, they witnessed a terrifying paradox. The Americans were not only physically robust and well-equipped, but they possessed a casual attitude toward resources that the Japanese found incomprehensible. One captured Japanese diary from a New Guinea campaign describes the site of an abandoned American camp. The soldier wrote with disbelief about finding half-eaten cans of meat, discarded leather boots that were still functional, and heaps of brass shell casings left to rust. To a man who was ordered to return every single spent cartridge to his commander for recycling, this waste was the ultimate proof of America's bottomless pockets. When rumors spread to Japanese ranks that the Americans had ships dedicated solely to making frozen milk ice cream, many soldiers simply refused to believe it. It felt like a fairy tale until they saw the barges with their own eyes through binoculars. This realization shattered the myth of Yamato Damashii superiority. If the Americans could play while they fought, the Japanese spirit was not fighting a man, but a machine. A fascinating and often overlooked angle of this logistical divide was the unexpected kindness that occurred during the final stages of island isolation. As Japanese garrisons wasted away, the American posture shifted from combat to a form of grim observation. On some islands, U.S. patrols would leave crates of sea rations or cigarettes near Japanese lines, not as a tactical ruse, but out of a humanizing pity for the walking ghosts they saw in the jungle. This created a massive moral crisis for the Japanese soldiers. They had been told that Americans were devils, kichigabe, who would torture and kill captives. Yet, here were these devils throwing chocolate bars and fresh oranges toward their trenches. In several documented cases, Japanese soldiers surrendered not because they were defeated in a firefight, but because the smell of American coffee or the sight of a soldier eating a thick sandwich broke their will to endure. The luxury shock acted as a silent recruiter for the Allied cause. It proved that the American way of life, freedom, abundance, and even polite power, was a more attractive reality than the starvation-driven honor promised by the high command in Tokyo. The war of calories had become a war for the soul of the common soldier. The tipping point of this logistical war arrived in the summer of 1944, during the isolation of the great fortress of Rabaul. Once the nerve center of Japanese operations in the South Pacific, Rabaul was home to nearly 100,000 elite troops, 5 airfields, and a massive natural harbor. The Japanese High Command considered it impregnable. But the Americans did something the Japanese military code had never prepared for. They simply walked away. By seizing the Admiralty Islands and the northern coast of New Guinea, the Allies threw a digital and physical noose around Rabaul, cutting the lifeline of the emperor. As the last supply submarine slipped away under the cover of darkness in February 1944, the 100,000 men of Rabaul were transformed from an offensive juggernaut into a starving colony. This was the Great Silence. The climax of their experience wasn't a grand explosion, but a slow, agonizing descent into a primitive struggle for existence. General Itoshi Mamura, the commander of the 8th Area Army, realized that the honor of his men was now tied to the soil. He ordered every soldier, from fighter pilots to master navigators, to pick up a hoe. The magnificent airfields were plowed over to plant sweet potatoes and eggplants. The elite of the Imperial Army became a desperate peasant class, fighting a war not against the Americans, but against the fungus, the rot, and the persistent hunger that gnawed at their discipline. While Imamura's men were digging in the dirt, the American logistics of plenty hit its terrifying peak. The U.S. Navy launched a mobile service-based concept at Ulithi Atoll. This was a floating city of 300 supply ships, repair docks, and, crucially, the refrigeration barges. Here, the contrast reached its most absurd and decisive level. On any given day in 1944, while a Japanese officer at Rabaul was carefully rationing a single bowl of watery rice for his entire squad, 6,000 miles away, the American industrial machine was delivering 600,000 gallons of fresh milk and millions of eggs to the fleet. The Americans had successfully decoupled their military power from the land. They carried their entire civilization with them on the waves. This was the moment the strategic turning point became a permanent reality. The Japanese were tied to the islands they were dying on, while the Americans were masters of a fluid, mobile universe of abundance. The true climax of this disparity was not found in a single explosion, but in a harrowing psychological breakdown that occurred during the final months of 1944. As the American blockade intensified, the luxury gap became a weapon of war more effective than the atomic bomb would later be. On the island of Bougainville, the situation for the Japanese 17th Army reached a gruesome crescendo known as the Second Battle of the Garden. The Japanese were no longer fighting to hold territory. They were fighting for the right to harvest their own sweet potatoes. The turning point was reached when the Japanese soldiers realized the Americans weren't even trying to stop their farming. They were mocking it. American pilots, flying low-level reconnaissance missions, began dropping leaflet bombs over the starving garrisons. But these weren't just propaganda papers. They were color-printed menus from San Francisco restaurants and photographs of American families sitting at Thanksgiving tables laden with turkey, ham, and mountains of mashed potatoes. This gastronomic warfare was the ultimate psychological climax. It forced the Japanese soldier to confront a reality his Bushido code couldn't explain. The enemy wasn't just stronger. The enemy was living in a different century of prosperity. While the Japanese troops at Bougainville and Rabaul were reduced to cannibalism in some extreme, documented cases, a final, horrific collapse of the military social order, the U.S. Navy was celebrating the commissioning of the world's first dedicated refrigerated floating warehouse. This was the USS Silas Bent, a ship designed to ensure that even in the most remote corners of the Philippine Sea, no American sailor would have to go more than 48 hours without fresh meat. The climax of the Pacific War was a moment the Japanese logistics system reached absolute zero, while the American system reached peak surplus. It was a moment the Imperial High Command realized that even if they killed every American soldier on a beachhead, another 1,000 would arrive the next day, backed by a fleet that had enough spare fuel to keep 10,000 tons of ice cream frozen in the middle of a tropical inferno. The war of attrition was over. The war of industrial humiliation had begun. When the news of the Japanese surrender finally reached the bypassed islands in August 1945, the Allied relief teams that landed were not met by a fierce, defiant army, but by a collection of living skeletons. The statistics that emerged in the following months were a haunting testament to the failure of the Japanese logistics doctrine. Of the roughly 2.3 million Japanese military deaths during the war, historians estimate that a staggering 60% to 70%, over 1.2 million men, died not from combat, but from starvation and related tropical diseases. On islands like New Guinea and the Marshalls, the ratio was even more lopsided. For every Japanese soldier killed by an American bullet, 10 died of hunger. As the Americans moved in the process of surrendering garrisons, the luxury shock hit its final, surreal peak. On the island of Wake, Japanese officers who had once executed American prisoners for stealing scraps were forced to stand in line as U.S. Navy cooks served them white bread, canned peaches, and hot coffee. For many of these men, who had spent years eating grass and rats, the richness of the food was too much for their shrunken stomachs to handle. Medical teams had to intervene to prevent refeeding syndrome from killing the very men they were trying to save. The physical aftermath was a landscape of waste. The Americans found thousands of pristine Japanese rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition in bunkers, but not a single grain of rice. The Imperial Army had plenty of spirit and plenty of lead, but it lacked the one thing that keeps a modern military functioning: the cavalry. The American logistics aplenty had effectively neutralized hundreds of thousands of elite troops without firing a major shot in their direction for over a year. The island-hopping strategy hadn't just defeated the Japanese military, it had rendered it irrelevant. The collapse of the Japanese logistical system left a permanent scar on the survivors of the Green Desert. As the prisoners were repatriated to devastated Japan, they carried with them stories that the civilian population could scarcely believe. The ice cream ships and the concrete barges became symbols of an American industrial godhood that had made the Japanese concept of total war look like a primitive struggle. In the post-war trials and memoirs, Japanese officers admitted that their greatest strategic failure was not a lack of courage, but a lack of imagination. They simply did not believe a nation could be so wealthy that it could prioritize dessert over ammunition. The American side of the aftermath was a different kind of revelation. The U.S. military emerged from the Pacific as the undisputed master of global logistics. The infrastructure built for Operation Ice Cream, the specialized refrigeration, the mass-produced rations, and the mobile supply fleets became the blueprint for the modern world. The technologies developed to keep food fresh in the Solomon Islands led directly to the commercial refrigeration boom and the globalized food supply chain of the 1950s. The war proved that the ability to move vast amounts of material across oceans was the ultimate form of power. When the final tallies were made at Rabaul, the Americans found that nearly 90,000 men had survived the isolation by becoming farmers. But they were a broken force. They had spent the last 2 years of the war not as warriors, but as laborers in the dirt, watching American planes fly overhead with an impunity that was soul-crushing. The luxury gap had achieved a psychological surrender long before the emperor's voice ever broadcasted across the radio. The Americans hadn't just won a war. They had demonstrated that in the 20th century, the nation with the most efficient refrigerator was just as dangerous as the nation with the fastest tank. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of empires. It was a testament to the fact that American freedom was backed by an unstoppable, well-fed machine. The story of the Pacific War is often told to the thunder of carrier decks and the grit of beachhead landings. But the true silent victor of the conflict was the American supply line, a sprawling, industrialized organism that treated the impossible as a standard operating procedure. While the Japanese military elite clung to an ancient warrior code that viewed logistical concerns as beneath the dignity of a soldier, the United States viewed logistics as the very heartbeat of democracy. The ice cream ships were not merely a symbol of decadence. They were a profound statement of value. They represented a nation that refused to let its sons be dehumanized by the squalor of the jungle. By providing the taste of home in the middle of a wasteland, the American command maintained the humanity and morale of its troops, while the Japanese self-sufficiency doctrine stripped their soldiers of everything but their desperation. As we look back at the 250,000 men left to rot on bypassed islands, we see a cautionary tale of hubris. Japan had built a sword of exquisite sharpness, but they had no way to carry it to fight. America, conversely, built a forge so massive that it could produce both the sword and the luxury to enjoy the victory. This disparity transformed the Pacific from a theater of war into a laboratory of modern civilization. Today, the rusted hulks of Japanese tanks still sit in the jungles of Bougainville, overgrown by the very vines that failed to sustain the men who manned them. Nearby, the concrete remains of American piers still stand, reminders of a time when the world's most powerful nation decided that even in the darkest hours of human history, there was always room for a bit of ice cream. It remains the ultimate testament to the fact that wars are not just won by those who are willing to die, but by those who are best prepared to live.